Hey everyone, it's Ali, and recently I finished pushing to 1,500 corruption as Shadow Dagger Falconeer. What I want to do in today's video is talk about my experience with pushing, as well as going over my gear and giving people a few tips. Finally, what I want to talk about at the end of the video is going to be the impending nerfs that are going to come to Shadow Dagger Falconeer and how we're going to mitigate that going forward. Now, the first thing that we should talk about is the pushing itself. Now, I stopped at 1,500 corruption, but realistically, with my current gear and my current setup, I could have most likely pushed all the way up to 2,000 corruption. I didn't bother to keep pushing simply because all of my gear was pretty damn min-maxed, and because of how min-maxed everything was, I didn't really have any more gear to chase for, and because of that, I just didn't really enjoy playing the build anymore due to the chase of gear and the chase of upgrades being a big driving factor for me enjoying a build. With that said, Shadow Dagger Falconeer is literally the most fun build I've ever played in any ARPG period, and it was one of the most fun times I've ever had in this game, simply due to all the community collaboration we've had in terms of min-maxing and theory crafting this build, as well as the gameplay itself of the build just being so damn fun. My experience to 1,500 was pretty comfortable. I didn't really have any issues. I didn't really have any troubles, with the exception of damage over time. Damage over time in this game is currently so overtuned that it does somewhere around 5 to 10 times more damage than normal hits would normally do to you. The other thing to mention about damage over time is the majority of less damage taken modifiers don't actually end up applying to dots, and because of that, dots just end up not really being damage reduced that much, making them super deadly. Because of this, one of the most important things for high corruption pushing is a way to cleanse ailments off of you, which unfortunately I didn't really have too much of an access to, and because of that, if I ever got any sort of bleed or poison on me, it was very deadly, and it was the thing that I was actually concerned about, while hits really didn't do much to me. Now, I did start getting afraid of some AoE abilities as I started getting closer and closer to 1,500 corruption, but realistically, as you push higher and higher corruption, eventually every build is going to meet its maker, and the difficulty curve is going to keep scaling while your build isn't going to be able to keep up as much, making abilities deadly and making you feel squishier and squishier and squishier as everything starts doing more damage faster than you can keep up with your tankiness. But realistically, outside of dots, most of it was just fine. With that said, I could have potentially made my life a little bit easier. For example, I could have gone to Smoke Bomb and picked up Cleansing Steam. Now, I know my tree is a little bit scuffed here. I wouldn't have been giving up Shadow Hunter. I'd be giving up points in Smoke Blades because Smoke Blades does substantially less for me than Shadow Hunter does. But like I said, I would just be giving up some points anywhere on my Smoke Bomb tree. Realistically, I could also give us some points in Rapid Concealment. And I'd come over to Cleansing Steam and pick up this, as this gives me a way to at least cleanse ailments off of me. Now, unfortunately, this only happens when you actually use your Smoke Bomb. So realistically, it wouldn't have been that consistent, but it would have at least been better than nothing. The other way I could have potentially dealt with ailments moving forward was to instead put ailment cleanse when I use a potion on my jungle queens, and then just save all my health pots for any moment that I get any sort of debuff on me. Now, unfortunately, in my case, I didn't end up getting that role on my belt, and at the same time, the roles on my current jungle queens are roles I'm pretty happy with, so I never end up actually chasing a new jungle queens or chasing an ailment role on my belt. But realistically, if I did want to push to 2,000 corruption, that would have been probably one of the first things I would have actually done, was to chase down an ailment cleansing jungle queen to allow me to not really die to poisons or bleeds basically instantly. Now, the other thing to mention about pushing was specifically Oribus. Now, the further and further you push into corruption, Oribus starts becoming more and more difficult. Oribus realistically starts becoming a pretty big roadblock, and the biggest issue here was specifically poison Oribuses. If I ever got to a poison Oribus, I immediately just opened a portal and left and just went and found a new Oribus to fight, as poison Oribus, due to just how much damage dots do, becomes basically unviable to do due to the fact that if you die, you lose your gaze of Oribuses, and that just makes you lose 30 minutes of your life, versus you spending an additional 5 to 10 minutes to find a new Oribus that is specifically not poison Oribus. With all that out of the way, why don't we very quickly go over my gear and talk about all the choices that I made. Now, like I said, my gear is pretty damn min-maxed. The only things I'm not happy with is my chest plates due to the base of the chest plate being kind of bad, and my boots for the same exact reason, as I don't need the reduced damage taken from crits. With that said, this chest plate was just way too good for me not to use, but if I did want to upgrade this, I'd look for a falconry base chest plate with exalted ward gain when you create a shadow instead of exalted health. The same would go for my boots, where instead of using a pair of Citadel boots, I'd instead be looking for a Vanguard pair of boots, the ward retention pair of boots, or the percent dodge pair of boots. In terms of my gear, a lot of my gear was actually dictated by my rings. Red rings are basically best in slot for almost all builds, especially if you want to push high corruption, simply because they both have 10% less damage taken if you have 180 total attributes, and this roll stacks together, giving you 20% less total damage taken. The thing about these is that you need 180 total attributes to actually get this effect to work, which is relatively difficult for most builds to actually achieve. The other thing to mention here is that they also give you 5 to all attributes, and because of that, these red rings can effectively be considered 25 total attributes, or between the two of them, 50 total attributes, meaning you only need 130 attributes yourself. Because they end up giving so much, it's kind of hard to just use one by itself because the second one actually makes the first one easier to put on due to them both benefiting each other for the 180 total attribute requirement. The other thing to mention here is that they also give you quite a lot of all res, making me not really need many resistances on much of my gear, meaning all of my gear basically just became health rolls and dodge rolls pretty much everywhere. With that said, because of the amount of attributes I needed, the rest of my gear was heavily focused around that. If we start with my helmet, I end up removing my falconry helmet and instead chasing down a 3LP Peak of the Mountain, which is relatively easy to get at a 4% drop rate, simply due to the fact that Peak of the Mountain can roll up to 5 all attributes, making my life substantially easier getting to the 180 total requirement. The other thing to mention here is that Peak of the Mountain gives you quite a lot of additional critical strike chance. If we look at my crit chance, I'm currently at 52%, and if I were to take off my Peak of the Mountain, I go down all the way to 30. This critical strike chance is quite a lot of critical strike chance, especially when I combine it with a crit chance from my smoke bomb, allowing me to hit somewhere around 80% raw bow critical strike chance, which my Falcon, through Go for the Eyes, is then turning into minion crit chance. In terms of LP, I end up going for Dexterity and a T7 word gain when you create a shadow roll. And unfortunately, the helmet that I use for this, because T7 word gain when you create a shadow is just so rare, only end up rolling a T1% health roll on it, but I'm more than happy with it given that I also end up getting the Dexterity and the word gain roll on the peak. Realistically, if I had a higher all attribute roll, my life would have been a lot easier, but I'm happy that I didn't roll a 2, as 2 would have actually made putting all this together substantially harder. For my chestplate, I did the same exact thing, where I just have a word gain when you create a shadow roll, as well as a dexterity roll, and for my suffixes, I just did the same thing where I got 2 health rolls. Realistically, I would have wanted this exalted roll to be either the exalted word gain when you create a shadow mod, or exalted percent health, as that would have actually given me substantially more health than exalted flat health would have given me in the first place. For my belts, as I mentioned earlier, I went for a Jungle Queens, simply due to the fact that Jungle Queens is way too efficient for this build to not consider. It gives me Dexterity, which is attributes towards my red rings, and at the same time, Dexterity is one of the best ways to scale this build further and further, and also gives our minion a little bit of additional physical damage, making this just way too efficient overall to not consider. In my case, I end up getting a 2LP Jungle Queens, and I end up crafting a belt that had throwing damage, percent physical damage, flat health, and CDR on it, and my belt end up eating the flat health and the CDR on it, making a Jungle Queens that I am very, very happy with. In my opinion, not having CDR on your belt and your boots just makes this build feel a little bit too bad, given that I would push your aerial assault CDR up a little bit too much, currently minus 2.8, and if I were to take off my belt, as you can see, it would go all the way up to 3.3, which in my opinion would just feel a little bit too bad. So that is why I made sure whatever Jungle Queens I use had a CDR roll on it. For my boots, I just end up using a pair of boots with Exalted Dexterity, and unfortunately, this is just the best Exalted Dexterity pair of boots I had, which means I had to use Citadel boots, which is not an efficient base. And I just put some pretty default stats on my boots with movement speed, CDR, and hybrid health. Hybrid health is substantially more efficient, as I mentioned earlier, because percent health is giving you a lot more health than flat health ever would give you, because you have so many sources of flat health, but you don't have any sources of percent health, making the percent health substantially more efficient. Now, one thing I could have done to make my life a little bit easier for these red rings is to have gone and gotten a new gambit with Dexterity on it as a Weaver mod, but personally, this gambit was one that I was actually really happy with, given the fact that it rolled tier 7 health and tier 3% critical strike chance. Personally, I just valued the T7 health roll quite high, but if you were to put this together yourself and you were struggling getting the attribute rolls, I would highly recommend to, instead of just using a gambit, to just use an exalted dexterity relic or to go chase down a dexterity gambit specifically. For my shield, I went for a pretty unconventional cradle. Now, I know I've been telling people to go and get themselves a all-res cradle as it helps you quite a bit, but realistically, with the amount of all-res my red rings were giving me, I didn't really need an all-res cradle anymore. And instead, I opted for a cradle that rolled T7 void res, giving me all of my void resistance in a single item, which makes it really efficient. While at the same time, this gives me 19% block chance, with the roll on the Golden Aegis itself being 13%, meaning I'm getting so much total block chance for my cradle that I was actually able to just completely drop all of my points in dodge and parry because I had so much glancing blow chance that these points were completely useless. In turn, what I ended up doing was actually picking up Tactician, which gave me quite a lot of additional throwing damage for my Falcon and a lot of additional melee damage for my Falcon, greatly boosting the damage of both aerial assault and dive bomb itself. For my weapon, I end up going for a pretty default weapon. I don't have Frailty or Armor Shred on any of my other pizza gear, so my 2 suffixes on this weapon just had to be Frailty and Armor Shred due to those 2 rolls being way too important. For my prefixes, I end up getting myself a T7 Exalted Critical Strike Chance roll, and I end up crafting a Critical Strike Multiplier roll on it, and I'm pretty happy with this dagger overall. For my amulets, I actually am not using a Omnis anymore. I know I've been telling people to use an Omnis, but again, due to red rings giving you so much resistance, I didn't need any of the rolls on my Omnis at all, meaning I was able to instead go for an Oracle Amulet, which is very, very important for pushing, given that it's making it take less damage over time, which again, dots are the scariest thing in high corruption. And I just end up getting myself a T6 flat dodge rating amulet, which is a pretty nice roll, given that dodge rating is a good way to make myself tankier, and given the fact that there's no other suffixes that make me tankier due to me not needing any resistances, so health and dodge rating are the single two best suffixes I could put on this amulet. And then for prefixes, I just end up putting crit multi and flat throwing damage, as those are the best ways for me to scale all my damage overall. Finally, for my gloves, I have a Ravenous Void, and Ravenous Void are pretty much just as rare as Red Wings are, but these are so powerful, especially in this build, that they are an absolute no-brainer to use as an endgame pair of gloves. Not only are the implicits on it amazing, with mine rolling 10 vitality and 7% increased health, giving me quite a lot of additional health, but the main feature of Ravenous Void is the fact that they give you these Void Barrier stacks, which make you take 5% less damage taken per stack. Now, as you might see here, currently I have 6 stacks of Void Barrier when I'm only supposed to have 3. That means my Ravenous Void are currently giving me 30% less damage taken, making them unbelievably irreplaceable for high corruption pushing. This is a bug that's been known in the game for almost years at this point, and the devs have been made very aware that this bug exists with Ravenous Void, but they have simply just not cared or not had time to actually fix this Ravenous Void bug. And well, because of this, we can just abuse the fact that Ravenous Void is, well, twice as strong as it actually should be. This bug is very, very simple to actually produce. If I were to put my Ravenous Void on normally, I would only go with 3 stacks of Void Barrier as intended. Now, what I can instead do is go into my settings and change my preferred region from whatever I'm currently at to a different server. If I then were to go and swap my zones, as you can see, I'm only at 3 stacks now, but if I were to go swap my zones to a different area in the campaign, such as the Temple of Atera, you will see that once we load in, my server is going to change from US West, US East, and well, would you look at that? My Void Barriers are now stacking again, and they're going to go all the way to 6 stacks. As I said, this is a bug that's been known in the game for a very long time, and the devs aren't going to do anything about it, so we might as well abuse it and make Ravenous Void twice as good as they already are. Now, finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the feature of this build. Obviously, we all know that Smoke Bomb and Dive Bomb are going to be nerfed to where we can't stack infinite Smoke Bombs, and because of that, the high-end pushing potential of this build is going to be severely hampered. Now, realistically, up to 1,000 corruption, you literally don't even care about the word gain on Shadow Creation mod at all. I didn't even personally add it into my build until about 1.2k corruption. I had 0 issues prior to actually adding the mod into my build. But realistically, if you wanted to push 2k corruption, and for example, in my case, if I wanted to push 2k corruption post nerf, it basically would become impossible, as we really need that word to actually be able to live. Because of that, the only option we have to push past 1,500 corruption post-nerf is going to be to specifically go low life. Now, I'm going to have a separate video on how to swap over to low life that's going to come out in a few days, and hopefully that video should answer pretty much every single question you have about eventually transitioning the build into a tankier version. I do want to point out that's going to do substantially less damage than you currently are, but that's not really important, as if you're just looking to push corruption, you don't really care about your damage. It's just going to make your corruption pushing a little bit slower. But if you're not tanky enough to actually live the damage that the monsters are doing, it doesn't matter how fast or how slow you go if you just cannot push the corruption itself. With all that said, cuties, this is one of the most fun builds I've ever played in any RPG period, and I'm so glad this was my starter build for the season, and I've just had an absolute blast being able to sit here and to theory craft this build with all the members of my community, and to just make this the best build we possibly could make. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. And at the same time, I stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask any of your questions there. If you just want to come by and be a part of a community, I'd be more than happy to see you around. And with all that said, cuties, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and I hope to see you all in the next video.